The room was filled with the heavy, sweet scent of expensive white lilies and the low, constant hum of Ray's law firm partners. It was their silver anniversary, a night that should have been about us, but as usual, it was about his career. Ray stood at the front of the ballroom, his glass raised high, looking every bit like the power attorney of the year the local magazines had dubbed him. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than some people's cars, and his smile was perfectly practiced for the cameras. I sat quietly beside him at the head table, smoothing the stiff fabric of a navy blue dress. He had picked it out for me weeks ago, claiming it looked supportive and matched the professional image he wanted to project to his colleagues. To everyone else, we were the ultimate power couple of the city. To Ray, I was just a part of the furniture that helped make him look good. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded at the right times, and played the role of the loyal, quiet wife. But inside, I felt a strange distance, as if I were watching a play rather than living my own life. I had no idea that in just a few minutes, the script of my life was going to change forever. About an hour into the event, I slipped away from the noise to help the caterers in the kitchen. I had always been hands-on with our parties, making sure every detail was perfect, so Ray wouldn't have to worry. As I approached the back area, I saw the service door was cracked open just a few inches. I stopped when I heard Ray's voice coming from the other side. He wasn't talking to a client, he was laughing with his senior partner. "Julie? She's the perfect lighthouse," he said, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty I had never heard before. Static, dependable, and completely hollowed out. She hasn't had an original thought since 2015. The partner chuckled, and Ray continued. "I keep her around because she makes the house look lived in. But professionally, she's finished. She's lucky I haven't traded her in for a newer model with a brain." I stood frozen, the silver tray in my hands, suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. He wasn't just being mean. He truly believed I was nothing. He thought I was an empty shell that he had graciously allowed to stay in his orbit. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't make a sound. "My name is Leah, and I am 42 years old. For 15 years, I have been the silent partner in Ray's life, the one who made sure his world kept spinning while he took all the credit." When I heard those words through the door, something inside me broke, but not in a way that made me want to cry. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't scream or burst through the door to confront him. Instead, I simply felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It was like a fog had finally lifted, revealing the man I had dedicated my life to as a stranger. I realized that my loyalty had been seen as weakness, and my silence as stupidity. I took a deep breath, adjusted my expression back into the mask of the supportive wife, and walked back into the party. I sat back down at our table, looked Ray right in the eye as he returned, and calmly finished my champagne. He didn't notice a thing. He just patted my hand as if I were a pet. That was his first mistake. He thought he knew me, but he had no idea who I really was. That night, while Ray slept soundly, dreaming of his next big court case, I went to my home office. It was a small room, tucked away at the end of the hall, that he always dismissively called my craft room. He thought I spent my time there scrapbooking or looking at recipes. I sat down at my desk and began to look through the digital files I had kept for years. For over a decade, I had been much more than a housewife. I had been ghostwriting his most complex legal briefs, researching the most obscure case laws, and strategizing his trial maneuvers while he sat in the spotlight and took all the credit. Every brilliant closing argument that won him a case had started as a draft on my computer. I realized then that I hadn't just been his wife, I had been his entire research and development department. Without my brain, Ray was just a handsome man in an expensive suit who knew how to talk loud. I looked at the stacks of work I had done for him for free, and I felt a new kind of power. He thought I was finished, but he didn't realize he was the one who was about to run out of ideas. A few days later, I told Ray over breakfast that I wanted to take a low-stress job at a local nonprofit just to stay busy. I made sure to sound a little bored, like I was just looking for a hobby to fill the hours. He didn't even look up from his tablet. He just patted my hand in that condescending way he always did, and told me it was a cute way to kill time. He probably thought I'd be sorting old clothes or answering phones for a few hours a week. What he didn't realize was that the nonprofit I had chosen was a massive land conservation trust. This wasn't just any charity. They were currently the primary adversary in Ray's firm's biggest pending lawsuit. It was a multi-million-dollar case involving a huge development project that his firm was pushing through. By joining the trust, I was placing myself right in the middle of his professional world, but from the opposite side. He saw it as a hobby. I saw it as the beginning of my new life. He was so convinced of my insignificance that he didn't even ask for the name of the organization. He just went back to his coffee, completely unaware that I had just stepped onto his battlefield. At the Conservation Trust, the atmosphere was completely different from the cold, ego-driven halls of Ray's law firm. Here, I wasn't Leah, the lawyer's wife. I was Leah, the senior analyst. They had seen my resume, the real one, and were thrilled to have someone with my background. I began my work by identifying the massive procedural holes in Ray's firm's filings. It was almost too easy. I knew exactly where the weaknesses were because I was usually the one who caught and fixed them before the documents ever left our house. This time, I stayed silent. I watched as the firm submitted motions that were sloppy and arguments that were full of gaps. I could see the mistakes piling up like a slow-motion car crash. My colleagues at the trust were impressed by how quickly I found the flaws in the opposition's strategy. They didn't know I had been the architect of that strategy for years. I sat in the meetings, taking notes and offering subtle guidance, all while maintaining the image of a quiet, hard-working employee. I was building a wall around Ray's case, brick by brick, and he was too busy being important to notice the ground shifting beneath his feet. As the weeks went by, the static and dependable version of me that Ray expected started to fade. He began complaining that the house was messy and that dinner wasn't ready when he got home. He was used to coming home to a perfectly managed museum, and now he was finding empty takeout containers and dust. "You're getting distracted by that little charity job, Leah," he warned one evening, looking annoyed. He said it like I was a child who had forgotten to do her chores. I didn't argue. I just apologized softly and suggested that he hire a housekeeper with the big win bonus he was so sure he was going to get from the land conservation case. Ray's eyes lit up at the suggestion. He loved the idea of spending more money he hadn't even earned yet. It made him feel successful to think about hiring more staff. "That's a good idea, Leah. You clearly can't handle both," he said, returning to his work. I just smiled and walked away. Every time he insulted my ability to manage the house, I just redirected him toward spending the money he was about to lose. It was a small, satisfying game. Ray's firm eventually hired a brilliant young associate to help with the heavy lifting of the trial preparation. Ray was thrilled because it meant he had someone else to do the boring work while he focused on the big picture. He began delegating all of his preparation to the kid, assuming that the Leah system was still running in the background to catch any errors. For years, I had been the final set of eyes on everything he did, proofreading every email, brief, and memo. But I had stopped proofreading his work weeks ago. I watched him send out documents with typos and weak citations that I could have fixed in seconds. He was so used to having a safety net that he didn't even realize it had been pulled away. The young associate was smart, but he didn't have my years of experience or my intimate knowledge of how Ray thought. Mistakes started to slip through, small ones at first, then larger ones. Ray was too arrogant to check the work himself, and the associate was too intimidated to question him. They were walking blindly into a legal minefield, and I was the one who had planted the mines. The first major blow came when Ray lost a preliminary motion that he had thought was a slam dunk. He came home that night absolutely furious, throwing his briefcase on the table and blaming the judge for being biased and out of touch. He paced the living room, ranting about how the legal system was failing. I sat on the sofa, listened quietly, and nodded in all the right places. I even poured him a glass of his favorite expensive scotch to calm his nerves. While he drank and complained about how everyone else was incompetent, I was mentally filing the final pieces of paperwork for my own independent legal consultancy. I had been setting up the legal and financial structure for my own firm in secret for months. I knew that when the dust settled, Ray's reputation would be in tatters, and I needed to be ready to stand on my own. It was a strange feeling, being the person he trusted most with his complaints, while being the very person who was orchestrating his defeat. I watched him take a big gulp of scotch, feeling no guilt at all. He had called me hollowed out. Now he was about to find out how much substance I really had. One of Ray's biggest mistakes was assuming he was the only one in the house with a real education. Years ago, I had quietly finished my LLM in environmental law through an online program while he was busy at the office. I'd never told him about it because I knew exactly what he would say. He had once told me that one JD in the family is enough, and that I should focus on supporting the breadwinner. He saw my education as a threat to his ego, so I kept it a secret to keep the peace. When my certification arrived in the mail, I didn't frame it or hang it on the wall. I tucked it behind the silk lining of my jewelry box, right next to the pearls he'd bought me to apologize for missing my birthday. That piece of paper was my ticket out, a credential that proved I was more than just a domestic anchor. It was my secret weapon, and I was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. Ray would often make jokes about how I probably couldn't even read a contract, and I would just laugh along, knowing that I was actually more qualified in environmental law than he was. A few months later, we attended a high-profile charity gala where the governor was the guest of honor. Ray was in his element, networking and trying to show off. He introduced me to the governor as his lovely domestic anchor, a phrase that made my skin crawl. The governor, a sharp man who actually cared about policy, asked for my opinion on the local land dispute that was currently in the news, the very case Ray was working on. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could get a single word out, Ray interrupted me. "Oh, Leah doesn't worry her head about the law," he said with a condescending chuckle, patting my shoulder as if I were a child. "She's more of a garden and gallery girl." The governor looked at me, then back at Ray, and I could see a flash of disappointment in his eyes. Ray didn't even notice. He just kept talking, moving the conversation toward himself and his own brilliance. I stood there, smiling politely, while inside I was burning with a cold, quiet rage. He had just humiliated me in front of the most powerful person in the state, and he thought he was being charming. I didn't let the moment pass entirely. I waited until Ray headed to the bar to get another round of drinks for his important friends. Once he was gone, I stepped closer to the governor. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in and gave him a 30-second, high-level legal breakdown of the conservation case. I pointed out the specific environmental regulations that Ray's firm was trying to bypass and explained why the trust's position was legally superior. I spoke with the authority of someone who had spent hundreds of hours studying the case. The governor's eyes widened in surprise, and he went completely speechless for a moment. He looked at me as if he were seeing a person for the first time, rather than a piece of background scenery. "Why haven't I heard this from your husband's firm?" he asked. I just gave him a knowing smile. "Because they aren't looking at the right laws," I replied. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, and handed it to me. "Send me your CV," he whispered just as Ray started walking back toward us. I tucked the card into my clutch, my heart racing with the thrill of the win. While Ray was busy focused on his big win, I started securing my own financial future. I began moving my personal inheritance, money from my grandmother that Ray thought I had spent years ago on shoes and nonsense, into a private, secure account he couldn't access. I was meticulous, making sure the paper trail was invisible to him. During my research into our finances, I discovered something shocking. Ray had been skimming money from our joint savings to fund a get-rich-quick tech investment that was rapidly failing. He was so desperate to prove he was a financial genius that he was gambling with our future. He hadn't told me about it, of course, because he thought I was too hollowed out to understand numbers. I watched the accounts dwindle, seeing the evidence of his arrogance and greed laid bare. He was projecting an image of wealth and success while secretly drowning in debt. It was the ultimate irony. The man who claimed I was finished was the one who was actually destroying himself. I didn't confront him. I just kept moving my own money and documenting every single one of his unauthorized transfers. I was building a cage of evidence, and Ray was walking right into it. The day of the big trial finally arrived. Ray was more confident than I had ever seen him, convinced that his charm and brilliance would carry the day. He spent the morning admiring himself in the mirror and practicing his opening statement. He had no idea that the anonymous consultant who had been helping the Conservation Trust for months was the very person sleeping 3 feet away from him every night. I had mapped out his entire cross-examination strategy, identifying every witness he would call and every question he would ask. I had handed the perfect counter-moves to the Trust's lead counsel weeks ago. I knew Ray's patterns better than he knew them himself. I knew when he would try to bully a witness and when he would try to use a legal loophole. Every trap he had planned had a counter-trap waiting for him. I watched him leave for the courthouse, looking like a king going to his coronation. He thought he was prepared for anything. He had no idea that the most dangerous person in the courtroom wasn't the opposing lawyer. It was the wife he had dismissed as a lighthouse. On the morning of the trial, I made him his favorite breakfast, eggs Benedict and fresh coffee. I even helped him straighten his tie, making sure the knot was perfect. I looked him in the eye and gave him a warm, encouraging smile. "You're going to get exactly what you deserve today, Ray," I said, my voice steady and calm. He laughed, genuinely touched by what he thought was a supportive compliment from his loyal wife. "I always do, Leah," he replied, patting my cheek before heading out the door. He walked away with a spring in his step, fueled by his own ego and the belief that he was invincible. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something. Not pity, but a recognition of how far he had fallen without even knowing it. I went back inside, cleared the table, and then went to my office to change. I didn't put on the supportive dress he liked. I put on a sharp, charcoal gray power suit that I had bought with my own money. Today wasn't about supporting him. Today was about finally standing up for myself. I didn't show up at the courthouse to sit in the gallery and clap for him. Instead, I walked through the heavy wooden doors and went straight to the plaintiff's table. The room went silent as I took my seat next to the lead counsel for the Conservation Trust. A few minutes later, Ray walked in, laughing and joking with his associates. When he looked over and saw me sitting there, his face went from a confident tan to a sickly ashen gray. He stopped mid-sentence, his jaw literally dropping. He looked at me, then at the lawyers beside me, then back at me. As if he couldn't believe his own eyes. I didn't wave or smile. I just looked at him with a calm, neutral expression. His senior partner, who was sitting behind him, looked equally stunned. The man who had laughed at the idea of me having an original thought was now staring at me in a setting where he couldn't ignore me. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Ray wasn't the power attorney anymore. He was a man who had been caught completely off guard by the woman he had underestimated for 15 years. The judge entered the room, and the trial began. After the opening statements, the judge looked toward our table and asked for my credentials and role in the proceedings. I stood up, my voice clear and unwavering. I presented my LLM in environmental law and my formal appointment as the Trust's special legal advisor. Ray jumped to his feet, his face red with anger and embarrassment. He tried to object, shouting about a conflict of interest and claiming that I was just a disgruntled spouse. The judge looked at him with a cold, unimpressed stare. He reminded Ray that I had never been an employee of his firm, and that I was a private citizen with my own professional qualifications. The judge even quoted Ray's own public statements about me being a housewife, with no original thoughts, back to him, pointing out that Ray couldn't have it both ways. If I was as insignificant as Ray had claimed, then there could be no conflict of interest. The courtroom was silent, and I could see the sweat starting to bead on Ray's forehead. He had been hoisted by his own petard, and he had no one to blame but himself. During a short recess, the tension in the hallway was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ray wouldn't even look at me, but his senior partner did. To my surprise, the partner approached me, completely ignoring Ray, who was pacing nearby. He looked nervous, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate kind of politeness. He revealed that the firm had actually known for years that I was the ghost behind Ray's best work. They had been charging their clients premium rates for my briefs while paying me nothing. They knew exactly how valuable I was, even if Ray was too blinded by his own ego to see it. He looked me in the eye and offered me a deal. Ray's office and a senior partnership in the firm, if I would agree to drop the lawsuit and come back to work for them. They were willing to fire Ray on the spot to keep me. It was the ultimate validation, but also the ultimate betrayal. They had been profiting from my labor in secret, letting me be insulted and dismissed while they got rich off my brain. Ray stood just a few feet away, hearing every word, his world crumbling around him. I looked at the senior partner and felt nothing but disgust. I calmly declined the partnership. Why would I want to be part of a firm that had exploited me for a decade? But I wasn't done. I revealed to him that during my research, I had discovered the firm's systematic skimming of client escrow accounts, the very same tech investments that Ray had been involved in. I told him that I hadn't just come to the courtroom to win a land conservation case. I had come as a formal whistleblower for the State Bar Association. I had already handed over a mountain of evidence, emails, bank records, and internal memos to the authorities. The partner's face went even paler than Ray's. He realized in that moment that I wasn't just trying to win a case, I was taking down the entire firm. Ray looked like he was about to faint. He had thought this was just a messy divorce or a professional disagreement. He didn't realize that his entire house of cards was falling down, and I was the one who had pulled the bottom card. As we were leaving the courtroom for the day, Ray caught up to me in the lobby, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and fear. He threatened to sue me for divorce and take everything I had. He screamed that I would be left with nothing. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my briefcase and handed his lawyer a blue folder. It contained the post-nuptial agreement that Ray had signed 5 years ago during a drunken celebration of one of his big wins. He had been so arrogant and so intoxicated by his own success that he hadn't even read it closely. He thought it was just a life insurance update I had asked him to sign. In reality, it was a document stating that in the case of proven professional malpractice or financial infidelity, he forfeited his share of the marital estate. I had discovered his skimming of our savings long before I decided to leave, and I had prepared for this moment years ago. His lawyer opened the folder, read the first page, and looked at Ray with a look of pure pity. Ray had signed away his future while he was busy laughing at mine. The final blow didn't even come from me. As we stood in the parking lot, Ray's phone began to ring incessantly. He tried to ignore it, but the caller ID showed his newer model, mistress, the woman he had been seeing behind my back. He had accidentally left his phone connected to the car's Bluetooth, and the call went live for everyone nearby to hear. She wasn't calling to comfort him or tell him she loved him. She was calling to tell him that she had been working as an undercover investigator for the trust's legal team the whole time. She had been the one providing me with the internal firm memos and the details of his get-rich-quick schemes. She had never cared about him. He was just a target, a weak man whose ego made him easy to manipulate. Ray stood there in the middle of the parking lot, listening to the woman he had traded me for tell him that she had been playing him from day one. It was a level of humiliation I wouldn't have even wished on an enemy. But for Ray, it was the perfect, poetic ending to his charade. There was one last piece of the puzzle Ray didn't know. The get-rich-quick tech company he had invested so much of our stolen money into hadn't just failed on its own. I hadn't just watched it collapse from the sidelines. Months ago, using the inheritance I had moved and some smart financial maneuvering, I had bought up the company's massive debt through an anonymous LLC. Because the company was failing so badly, I had been able to buy the debt for pennies on the dollar. This meant that I was now technically my husband's primary creditor. Every cent he still owed, every asset he had tied up in that failing venture, belonged to me. He wasn't just losing his house and his career, he was now legally beholden to the woman he had called finished. I owned his professional life, his financial life, and his future. He had spent years trying to keep me small, but in his greed and arrogance, he had handed me the keys to his entire world. He looked at me, the realization finally hitting him, and for the first time in 15 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a month, the law firm was completely disbanded, its reputation ruined by the escrow scandal. Ray was officially disbarred following the whistleblower evidence I had provided to the Bar Association. He lost his license, his status, and his pride all at once. A few weeks later, he stood in the empty foyer of our grand house, the house that was now legally mine alone. He was surrounded by boxes, looking smaller and older than I had ever remembered. He looked up at me and asked the question that had been eating at him since the trial began. How did you do this? You were finished. You were nothing. He still couldn't understand that the person he saw wasn't the person I actually was. He was still looking for the hollowed-out version of me, unable to accept that he had been outmaneuvered by the very person he thought he controlled. He was a man who had lived his life based on a lie, and now that the lie was gone, he didn't know how to exist. I looked at him, feeling a strange sense of peace. I didn't feel the need to gloat or scream. I wasn't finished, Ray, I said, my voice quiet and steady as I handed him his final suitcase. I was just waiting for you to finish talking so I could start working. I told him the truth, that he hadn't lost because I was mean or because the world was against him. He lost because he had stopped being competent the moment he started believing his own hype. He had relied on my brain for so long that he forgot how to use his own. He had mistaken my silence for emptiness and my support for weakness. I watched him walk out the front door for the last time, his head down, carrying the weight of his own failures. I didn't feel joy at his downfall, just a deep, satisfying sense of relief. The weight of his ego was finally off my shoulders, and the house felt lighter than it had in years. I closed the door and locked it, not with a bang, but with a quiet, final click. Today, my life looks very different. I am now the executive director of the State Conservation Bureau, a position I earned through my own hard work and the recommendation of the governor. I live in a smaller, much quieter house by the water, where the only thing I have to support is myself. It is a simple life, but it is mine. Every now and then, I see Ray's name pop up in the "Where Are They Now?" legal blogs. Usually, it's linked to some mid-level insurance scam or a failed consulting business. He is still trying to find a shortcut to the success he never really earned on his own. I don't feel anger toward him anymore. I don't even feel much of anything. When I think back to that silver anniversary party, I don't think about the betrayal or the insults. I think about the moment I realized that silence can be a weapon, and that time is the ultimate judge. I look out at the water, feeling the profound, beautiful silence of a life finally built on my own terms. I was never finished. I was only just beginning.